It's about to get interesting, so subscribe and hit like so you don't miss the top content.
I never thought I'd see him again. It had been 10 years, maybe more. Time seemed to have erased the days we'd been together, leaving only vague memories, like old photographs faded by time. But sometimes, in the silence, I caught myself remembering him, his smile, his laughter, his hands that held me so tightly, as if afraid to let me go. I'd been living in Chicago for 5 years now. The city was huge, bustling, full of life. But sometimes, especially in the evenings, when the lights of the skyscrapers burned outside my window, I felt lonely. My life was measured: work in a design studio, rare meetings with friends, walks along the waterfront of Lake Michigan. I was used to this rhythm, to this silence inside, and frankly, I thought it would always be that way. But one day, everything changed. It was an ordinary fall day. The leaves had already started to turn yellow, and the air was chilly, heralding the imminent arrival of winter. I was walking down the street, heading for the little cafe on the corner where I often got coffee before work. The cafe was called the Maple Leaf, a cozy place with wooden tables and the smell of fresh baked goods. I stepped inside, took off my gloves in a familiar motion, and walked up to the counter. And then I saw him. He was standing by the window, holding a cup of coffee. His face was so familiar, but at the same time different. Time had changed him. He was older, more serious, and there was a depth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But it was him, the same man who had once been everything to me. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I wanted to turn around and walk away, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. He looked up, and our eyes met. For a moment, time stood still. He recognized me. I could see it in his gaze, in the way he froze, as if he'd seen a ghost from the past. He slowly approached me, and I felt everything inside me clench. "Anna?" he said, and his voice sounded like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. I nodded, unable to find the words. My mind was in chaos. Memories came over me like a wave: our walks in the park, our conversations until morning, our last day when we'd parted. We were so young then, so naive. We thought the world belonged to us. But life was more complicated than we realized. "How are you?" he asked, and I could hear the same warmth in his voice that I'd heard before. "Good," I answered, though it wasn't quite true. "And you?" He smiled, but there was something sad in his smile. "Living," he said simply. We stood in front of each other, like two strangers who suddenly discovered they knew each other better than anyone else. I wanted to ask him a lot of things: where he'd been all these years, what had happened to him, why he'd disappeared from my life so suddenly, but the words stuck in my throat. "How long are you here for?" I finally asked. "No," he answered. "I'm here for work. I'm leaving in a couple days." I nodded, feeling something inside me clench. In a couple days, he'd be out of my life again, just like he was then, but this time I wasn't sure I could deal with it. "Why don't we get some coffee?" he suggested, and I could hear the hope in his voice. I said yes. We sat down at a table by the window and began a conversation that seemed to last forever. We talked about work, about life, about how we had changed over the years. But the most important thing remained unspoken. We both knew that there was still something between us that hadn't disappeared despite time and distance. As we walked out of the cafe, he took my hand. His touch was the same as before: warm, reassuring, comforting. "I missed you," he said softly. I looked at him and realized I missed him, too. Missed him, what we had between us, the love we'd lost. But now that he was here again, I didn't know what to do. We had both changed, and our past seemed so far away, but at the same time, I felt that if he left again, I would never forgive myself. We stood outside, holding hands, and I realized that I was on the verge of something important. Something inside me said this was my chance, a chance to start over. But was I ready? From that night on the rooftop, something inside me began to change. I couldn't explain exactly what it was, but it was as if someone had lit a small light inside me. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there, and it grew stronger every day. Leela started coming to me more often. She brought not only donuts and movies, but whole stories. Stories about people she'd met, places she'd been, dreams she wanted to fulfill. She spoke as if every moment of life was a gift to her. and I began to notice that her energy was slowly transferring to me. One day she took me to a park. It was early morning, and the city was just starting to wake up. We were walking along a path surrounded by trees, and she suddenly stopped, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. "Can you feel it?" she asked without opening her eyes. I looked at her, then at the trees, at the grass, at the first rays of sunlight breaking through the leaves, and suddenly I realized what I was feeling. I felt a silence that was filled with life. I could smell the fresh grass and earth after the rain. I could feel the wind touching my skin. It was a simple moment, but it was a revelation to me. I realized that I hadn't noticed such things for a long time. I had been so busy with my thoughts, my fears, that I had forgotten what it was like to just be. Leela opened her eyes and looked at me. She didn't say anything, but there was so much understanding in her gaze that it was clear to me. She knew. She knew I was starting to change. From then on, we spent even more time together. She showed me the city as if I were seeing it for the first time. We walked the narrow streets, went to little cafes that served the best coffee I had ever tasted, and sat on the beach listening to the sound of the waves. I began to notice that my days were brighter. Even work that used to seem like a chore now brought me pleasure. I began to see beauty in the lines of buildings, in the play of light and shadow. I began to notice how people smiled at each other, how children laughed while playing in the park. But most importantly, I began to feel. One evening we were sitting on the shore of the bay. The sun was setting, coloring the sky orange and pink. Leela was sitting next to me. Her feet were barefoot and she was playing with the sand with her toes. I looked at her and suddenly realized I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. It was a warmth that spread through my whole body, and at the same time a slight shiver, as if I were standing on the edge of something big and unknown. I wanted to say something to her, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just stared at her, trying to figure out what was happening to me. She turned to me and our eyes met. There was so much warmth in her gaze that I felt like I could drown in it. "Do you know what the most beautiful thing about you is?" she asked quietly. I shook my head, unable to say a word. "Your heart," she said. "It's still there. You've just forgotten how to listen to it." Her words touched something deep inside me. I felt something inside me clench and then let go. In that moment, I realized that Leela became more than just a person who entered my life. She became a light that showed me that I could still feel, that I could still love. But most importantly, she made me believe that I was worthy of it. From that evening on the bay, I began to notice that the world around me was different. Not that it had changed physically, no. The streets were still the same. The skyscrapers still towered over the city, and people hurried about their business. But something inside me shifted. I began to see colors where before I'd seen only grayness. Leela continued to be there for me. She didn't push me, didn't demand anything. She was just there, like a ray of sunshine breaking through the dense clouds. Her presence became something of an anchor for me, something that kept me in the moment, preventing me from drowning in my own thoughts. One day she suggested I take a dance class. I, of course, declined. Dancing? It wasn't for me. I couldn't even imagine moving to the music, feeling ridiculous and clumsy. But Leela wouldn't give up. "You don't have to be perfect," she said, "just let yourself feel it." And I agreed. It was one of the most awkward moments of my life. I stood in the corner of the hall, feeling all eyes fixed on me. But Leela was right next to me. She took my hand and started moving around, showing me what to do. I resisted at first, but then something clicked. I closed my eyes and just let myself be. And it was incredible. I can't say I've suddenly become a great dancer. No, I was still messing up my steps and stepping on my own feet. But in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. After class we walked outside and I couldn't stop smiling. Leela looked at me, and there was so much pride in her eyes that it made me feel warm inside. "See," she said, "you can do it." And I realized she was right. I could. From then on, we started trying something new every week. It was a painting class, or a hike in the mountains, or just a walk in an unfamiliar part of town. Each time I discovered something new, not only about the world, but also about myself. But most importantly, I began to discover my feelings. One evening we were sitting at my house. Leela was lying on the couch, and I was sitting on the floor with my back against the edge of the couch. We were talking about something insignificant, but suddenly she stopped talking. "Do you know what I noticed?" she asked. "What?" I asked, turning to her. "You're smiling more often," she said. I froze. I hadn't noticed it, but she was right. I did start to smile, and laughing, and feeling. "It's because you're there for me," I said without thinking. She looked at me, and there was something in her eyes that I couldn't understand. "You deserve to be happy," she said softly. Her words hit something deep inside me. I felt something clench in my chest and then let go. "I don't know what it's like to be happy," I admitted. "You're on your way," she said. And I believed her. From that night on, I began to notice something inside me slowly opening up, like a bud slowly turning into a flower. It was a strange feeling, frightening and beautiful at the same time. I was afraid of it because it made me vulnerable, but at the same time I couldn't deny that it brought me joy. Leela became more than just a friend to me. She became someone who helped me see the real me. Thanks to her, I began to realize that my fears, my doubts were not what defined me. They were a part of me, but not the whole me. One day we took a trip out of town. It had been her idea. Like so many other things lately, we stopped at the edge of the woods where a path led to a small lake. The water was mirror smooth, reflecting the sky and the trees along the shores. We walked in silence, and I could feel the nature around us speaking to me in a language I was only now beginning to understand. We sat on the shore, and I closed my eyes, listening to the wind play with the leaves, to the birds singing somewhere in the distance. I felt something inside me calm down, as if everything I'd been holding in for so long had finally found its way out. Leela sat next to me, and her presence was as natural as breathing. I didn't know how to express what I felt in that moment. Gratitude? Yes, but it was more than that. It was a feeling I couldn't name, but one that filled me with warmth. When we got back to the city, I realized something had changed. I was no longer afraid to look at myself in the mirror. I was no longer avoiding people, no longer shutting myself off from the world. I began to see beauty in the little things, in the smile of the barista who made my coffee, in the laughter of children playing in the park, in the way the light of the streetlights reflected in the puddles after the rain. But most importantly, I began to see the beauty in myself. One evening I stood on the balcony of my apartment and looked out over the city. The lights of the skyscrapers twinkled like stars, and I felt something inside me expand. I realized I didn't want to hide anymore. I wanted to live, for real. Leela was there for me, as always. She didn't say anything, but her presence was all I needed. I turned to her and looked into her eyes. In them, I saw what I'd been looking for a long time: acceptance. And in that moment I realized that love was not something to be found somewhere far away. It was right here, right next to me. It was in every moment we shared, in every look, in every touch. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I was ready to move forward. Time passed, and I began to notice my life slowly filling with new colors. It was like waking up after a long sleep. I began to notice things that had seemed insignificant to me before: the way the sunlight fell on the floor of my apartment in the morning, the way the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the scent of rain outside my window, the way people on the streets smiled even if their day was not going well. Leela was there for me, and her presence became something like a compass for me. She didn't show me the way, but her energy, her faith in me helped me find it on my own. I began to realize that love is not only a feeling for another person, it is also love for myself, for life, for the world around me. One day we went to the coast. It was a spontaneous decision. Like so much of what we did together, we walked along the beach, and I could feel the sand under my feet getting cooler with each step. The waves lapped against the shore, leaving behind foam that dissolved into the sand. I stopped and closed my eyes, breathing in the salty air. At that moment, I felt something inside me let go. All my fears, doubts, resentments, they seemed to dissolve like those waves. Leela stood next to me, and I knew she felt the same way. We didn't say a word, but there was more understanding in the silence than in any words. When we got back to town, I realized I was ready for a new phase. I started writing. At first they were just notes in a notebook, short thoughts that popped into my head, but gradually they turned into something more. I started writing about what I felt, what I saw, what I experienced. Leela became my first reader. She didn't criticize, she didn't give advice, She just read and smiled, and in her smile, I saw what I needed: support and faith. One evening I was sitting at my desk, rereading my notes. Leela was lying on the couch, covered with a plaid, and looking at me. "Do you know what the most beautiful thing about you is?" she asked. I raised my eyes and looked at her. "You can see beauty in even the simplest things," she said. Her words hit something deep inside me. I realized that she was right. I began to see beauty not only in the world around me, but also in myself. And in that moment, I realized that love is not something that comes once and stays forever. It is something that must be cherished, nurtured, created every day.